My name is Harold Beckett. I'm 74 years old, and 6 days after my daughter ignored the warning signs I described to her over the phone, dismissing them for a wine-tasting weekend with friends, she sat across from me needing my signature on a medical power of attorney because the stroke I'd been trying to warn her about had already happened, and I was the only one who could still legally give her the authority she now desperately needed. Welcome to Silent Honor, where we tell true stories about the quiet strength it takes to be underestimated by the people who need you most and still choose to show up for them anyway. If you've ever tried to tell someone something important and watched them decide it could wait, this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight, and hit subscribe because you're going to want to see exactly what happened in the 6 days between that phone call and the hospital room that changed everything. Let me start where this really begins. I spent 39 years as a high school science teacher, the last 20 of them also serving as the school's emergency response coordinator, trained extensively in recognizing and responding to medical emergencies, a role I took seriously enough that I completed advanced first aid certifications well beyond what the position technically required. My wife Constance passed 5 years ago, a sudden heart attack that gave neither of us any warning at all, and in the years since, I've lived alone in the same modest house at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, keeping myself busy with a garden, a standing Thursday coffee with 2 retired colleagues, and the particular kind of vigilance about my own health that comes from having watched a spouse die without any warning whatsoever. That vigilance is part of why, 6 days before everything changed, I recognized something in my own body that concerned me enough to call my daughter Rachel directly, rather than simply waiting to mention it at our next regular visit. I want to tell you about Rachel before I tell you about that phone call, because I don't think this story makes sense without understanding who she actually is. Not as a villain, but as a genuinely busy, well-intentioned woman who made a specific mistake in a specific moment. A mistake that very nearly cost her far more than she understood at the time she made it. Rachel is 41. Married to a good man named David, mother to 2 teenagers who keep both of their lives considerably busier than either of them anticipated when the kids were small. She works as a marketing director for a regional firm, genuinely demanding work that regularly extends well beyond typical business hours, and in the years since Constance passed, she's been, by most reasonable measures, an attentive daughter. Regular visits, holiday planning, the ordinary rhythm of a caring adult child managing a relationship with an aging parent alongside her own full life. I don't say any of that to excuse what happened. I say it because I think it matters, understanding that Rachel wasn't someone who'd shown a pattern of dismissing me before this particular week. What happened was, in some ways, more troubling precisely because it was so uncharacteristic, a genuine misjudgment rather than a symptom of some longer, more obvious neglect. 6 days before the hospital, on a Tuesday evening, I noticed a specific cluster of symptoms that immediately concerned me, given my training. A sudden, unusual weakness in my left hand that made it difficult to grip a coffee mug properly. A brief moment lasting perhaps 30 seconds, where the right side of my face felt strangely numb, a sensation I recognized immediately from decades of first aid training as a potential warning sign of a transient ischemic attack, sometimes called a mini-stroke, a serious warning that a larger stroke could follow within days if the underlying cause wasn't properly evaluated. I called Rachel that same evening, describing the symptoms carefully and specifically, using language I knew, from my training, was medically significant rather than vague. "Rachel," I said, "I need you to actually listen to this carefully. I had some numbness on the right side of my face this afternoon, and my left hand felt unusually weak for a few minutes. I know what this can mean. I think I need to see a doctor about this in the next day or 2, not eventually, actually soon, and I'd feel better if someone came with me for the appointment, given what these symptoms can sometimes indicate." I want to be honest about the specific quality of Rachel's response that evening, because I think the details matter more than a general summary would capture. She was sympathetic, genuinely, asking a few follow-up questions, expressing real concern in her voice. But underneath that concern, I could hear the particular distraction of someone whose mind was already partially elsewhere, and near the end of the call, She mentioned, somewhat apologetically, that she and David had a wine-tasting weekend planned with several other couples, a trip they'd booked months earlier to a vineyard region about 3 hours away, departing that Friday. "Dad, I really think you should call your doctor Monday and get it checked out," she said. "I don't want to freak you out, but I also don't want to cancel this whole weekend if it's not actually urgent. Can you call the doctor's office tomorrow and see what they say? If they think it's serious, I can figure something out. But if it's more of a wait-and-see thing, I'd really rather not cancel on David and everyone else at the last minute." I want to describe what I remember most clearly about that call, which wasn't anything Rachel said directly, but the particular quality of the silence that followed my description of the symptoms. A silence I recognized, even in the moment, as someone doing quiet mental math about how seriously to weigh an uncertain medical concern against a commitment already circled on the calendar for months. I didn't push back on that silence at the time. I told myself, the way people in my position often do, that pushing too hard might come across as an aging parent exaggerating symptoms for attention, a fear that, looking back, probably cost both of us more than either of us understood at the time. I called my doctor's office the following morning, as she'd suggested, and reached a nurse triage line rather than my actual physician, who was out that particular week. The nurse, working from my description over the phone rather than an actual physical examination, suggested I schedule a routine appointment within the next week or two, a genuinely reasonable recommendation given the limited information available to her, though not, as it turned out, an assessment that accounted for the full urgency the situation actually warranted. I relayed this information to Rachel that same day, and I want to be honest that some part of me, hearing the nurse's more measured response, allowed myself to feel slightly less alarmed than my own training had initially suggested I should be. Rachel, hearing the same measured assessment, made the decision to proceed with the wine-tasting weekend as planned, departing that Friday with David and their friends, reachable by phone but 3 hours away and, as it turned out, largely unreachable during the specific window when everything actually happened. Let me pause the story right here for just a second, because I want to ask you something, watching at home right now. Have you ever tried to communicate something urgent to someone you love, only to watch it get filtered down into something that felt manageable enough to postpone? How did that turn out for you, and did the person you were trying to warn ever fully understand what they'd almost missed? Tell me in the comments, because I read every single one, and if this story is already feeling familiar to you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because what happened that Saturday morning is the part of this story you really don't want to miss. Saturday morning, 2 days after Rachel left for the vineyard, I woke up feeling generally fine, made my usual pot of coffee, and sat down to read the newspaper the way I do most mornings. About 40 minutes later, reaching for my coffee mug, I found I couldn't properly grip it, my left hand simply not responding the way it should have, and within moments, the entire left side of my body had begun to feel strange, heavy, disconnected in a way I recognized immediately, with a clarity that cut through even the fear of the moment, as an active stroke in progress. I want to tell you honestly that my training took over in that moment in a way I'm genuinely grateful for, even now. I managed, with my working right hand, to call 911, giving the dispatcher my address and describing my symptoms clearly enough that she immediately dispatched an ambulance with appropriate urgency, correctly identifying the situation as a likely stroke requiring immediate transport. I unlocked my front door before the paramedics arrived, anticipating that I might not be able to reach it myself by the time they got there, and then I sat down on my living room floor, because I understood, from decades of training, that falling from a standing position would create additional complications the emergency team would then have to address alongside the primary emergency. I remember, sitting on that floor waiting for the ambulance, a strange, distant clarity settling over me despite the fear. The same clarity I'd relied on for decades walking students and colleagues through emergency drills, the part of my mind that separates the actual crisis from the panic trying to overwhelm it. I remember thinking, specifically, about Constance, about how sudden and undefended her own final moments had been, and feeling, even then, a strange gratitude that at least this crisis was giving me a fighting chance to respond properly, rather than simply happening to me the way hers had. The paramedics arrived within 11 minutes, and the specific speed of that response, combined with my own ability to communicate clearly despite the developing symptoms, meant I received clot-dissolving medication within the critical window doctors describe as essential to minimizing long-term stroke damage, a window that closes, in most cases, within about 3 to 4 hours of symptom onset. I called Rachel from the ambulance, my speech already somewhat affected but still comprehensible. And I want to be honest about what that call was actually like, because I think it matters. Her phone went to voicemail twice before she finally answered. On the third attempt, background noise suggesting she was in the middle of an outdoor vineyard tour, laughter and conversation audible behind her voice as she picked up. "Dad, everything okay?" she asked, her tone still carrying the relaxed warmth of a genuinely enjoyable weekend away. "Rachel," I said, my words coming out somewhat slower than usual. "I'm having a stroke. I'm in an ambulance right now. I need you to come home." I heard the exact moment the relaxed warmth in her voice disappeared entirely, replaced by a sharp, immediate panic. "Oh my God, Dad. Oh my God, I'm coming right now. I'm so sorry. We're leaving immediately." The drive from the vineyard region took just over 3 hours, and I want to tell you honestly that those 3 hours, sitting in a hospital room receiving treatment, were among the loneliest of my life. Not because the medical staff wasn't attentive and genuinely excellent, but because the specific fear of a stroke, the uncertainty about how much function I might eventually recover, is a fear that wants, desperately, a familiar face in the room, and for 3 hours, the only familiar face available to me was my own reflection in a darkened window. Rachel arrived at the hospital just over 3 hours after that phone call, rushing into my room with David close behind her, her face carrying an expression of genuine devastation that told me, clearly, she'd spent every minute of that drive fully understanding the weight of what had happened. "Dad," she said, taking my hand, the one that still worked properly, "I am so sorry. I should have come home the moment you called me on Tuesday. I should have canceled this whole trip the second you described those symptoms. I kept telling myself the doctor's office said it could wait, and I used that as permission to do what I actually wanted to do instead of what I should have done." I want to be honest about how I felt in that moment, because I think it matters more than a simple, generous forgiveness would suggest. I was genuinely glad she'd come, genuinely moved by the visible depth of her remorse. But underneath that gladness, something in me, the same part that had felt quietly dismissed 6 days earlier, wasn't quite ready to simply absolve the entire sequence of events without at least naming it clearly. "Rachel," I said, my speech still somewhat labored, "I described those symptoms to you specifically because I recognized them from my training. I told you I thought it was serious. And I understand the nurse's assessment gave both of us permission to feel less alarmed than we probably should have. But Rachel, you're my daughter, and when I tell you something feels urgent, I need you to actually trust that instinct, not just the triage nurse's second-hand assessment of a phone description." "You're right," she said, and I watched tears form in her eyes. I think some part of me wanted the less urgent version to be true, because it was more convenient, and I let myself believe it too easily. I'm not going to make excuses for that. I made the wrong call, and I almost lost you because of it. 6 days after that initial phone call, on the day I was scheduled for a series of follow-up procedures to assess the full extent of the stroke's impact, my neurologist explained that given the uncertainty about my speech recovery and the possibility of additional complications during the procedures, it would be prudent to have a medical power of attorney formally in place, designating someone who could make time-sensitive medical decisions on my behalf if I became unable to communicate clearly during a critical moment. Rachel sat with me that afternoon as the hospital's patient advocate walked us through the paperwork, and I want to describe what happened in that room, because it's the actual heart of this story, more than the stroke itself or the missed phone call that preceded it. "Dad," Rachel said, "before I signed anything, I need to say something first, and I need you to actually hear it, not just move past it because we're both stressed about the paperwork deadline. 6 days ago, I chose a wine tasting weekend over believing you about something urgent, And I need you to know that if you don't feel ready to give me this authority, if you'd rather designate someone else, I would understand completely, and I wouldn't hold it against you. I want to be honest about how much that offer actually meant to me, sitting in that hospital bed. I could have taken her up on it, genuinely. I have a good friend, a fellow retired teacher named Walter, who I trust considerably. And part of me, still carrying the specific hurt of that unanswered urgency 6 days earlier, considered exactly that alternative in the moment she offered it. Let me ask you something first, I said. If our positions were reversed, if I'd been the one to hear you describe those symptoms and chosen a weekend trip over taking you seriously, what would you need to see from me before you trusted me with something this significant again? She thought about that carefully before answering. I think I'd need to see you actually understand what you'd almost cost me, not just apologize for the scheduling conflict, but sit with the real weight of it. And I think I'd need to see that understanding show up in how you behaved afterward, not just in what you said in the hospital room. That's exactly right, I said. And that's exactly what I've been watching for these past 6 days, sitting in this bed. Not an apology, a demonstration. Have I shown you that? She asked, and I could hear real uncertainty in the question. Not fishing for reassurance, but genuinely unsure of the answer. You have, I said. Every single day since that ambulance ride, you've been here, genuinely present, not just physically in the room, but actually paying attention. That's the demonstration I needed. I appreciate you saying that, I told her. And I want you to understand something before I answer. I'm not signing this because you're my daughter, and families simply do this reflexively for each other. I'm signing it because I believe, watching how you've shown up in this room every single day since that ambulance ride, that you've actually understood what happened, not just apologized for it in the moment. I have understood it, she said. I've thought about almost nothing else for 6 days. I keep replaying that phone call, hearing myself weigh a wine-tasting weekend against what you were trying to tell me, and I don't think I'll ever fully forgive myself for how close that decision came to costing you everything. Let me pause again for just a moment, because I think this next part matters considerably. I signed that medical power of attorney that afternoon, designating Rachel as my healthcare decision-maker, not as a gesture of easy forgiveness, but because I'd watched, over 6 days in that hospital, a genuine, sustained shift in how she showed up, present at every appointment, asking real questions of my medical team, staying overnight more than once, despite her own demanding job and family responsibilities waiting at home. The weeks that followed my discharge were their own kind of difficult, requiring extensive physical therapy to regain full strength in my left hand, and speech therapy to address the mild slurring that lingered longer than I'd initially hoped. Rachel attended nearly every therapy appointment during those first crucial weeks, rearranging her own work schedule in ways I later learned had required some difficult conversations with her employer. Conversations she never once mentioned to me directly, only revealed later by David, who told me, quietly, how seriously she'd taken the recovery process. My physical therapist, a patient young man named Kevin, who'd worked with dozens of stroke patients over his career, mentioned to me privately, a few weeks into treatment, that he could usually tell within the first month which patients had genuinely engaged family support and which were navigating recovery more or less alone. Your daughter's here every single session, he said, asking real questions, taking notes on the exercises so she can help you practice at home. That consistency actually matters for recovery outcomes, more than people realize. There was an afternoon, about a month after the stroke, when Rachel asked if she could talk with me honestly about what had actually happened in her own thinking during that Tuesday phone call. A conversation I think mattered as much as any of the medical recovery itself. I think, she said, sitting with me in my garden, watching me slowly relearn the fine motor skills needed to properly hold gardening tools, that I've spent years assuming you were simply the reliable, low-maintenance parent, someone who'd always understand if plans needed to shift around something more urgent in my own life. And I think that assumption made it easier for me to discount your own urgency, because some part of me had quietly decided your needs were flexible in a way that other people's weren't. That's an honest thing to notice about yourself, I said. I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't had all that training, she said. If you hadn't known to unlock the door, to sit down before you fell, to describe your symptoms clearly enough on the phone with 911. If any of that had gone differently because you were alone, because I'd chosen a wine-tasting weekend over trusting you, Dad, I don't think I could have lived with that outcome. You don't have to live with that outcome, I said. You have to live with what actually happened, which is difficult enough on its own, and with what you do differently going forward, which matters considerably more than continuing to relitigate the version of events that didn't happen. I want to tell you honestly what's changed in the months since that stroke, because I think it matters more than the crisis itself. Rachel calls regularly now, genuine conversations rather than the more sporadic check-ins that characterized our relationship before, and when I mention anything that concerns me about my health, however minor it might seem, she takes it seriously immediately, asking careful follow-up questions rather than filtering my concerns through whatever else happens to be occupying her calendar that particular week. She's also, I've noticed, become considerably more direct with her own friends and colleagues about setting boundaries around family emergencies, a shift she described to me once as a direct consequence of that week. I used to think being flexible and easygoing about family stuff was a virtue, she told me. Now I understand that sometimes it just means the people who love you learn they can't fully rely on you when it actually matters. I finished physical therapy about 4 months after the stroke, regaining nearly full function in my left hand, my speech returning to normal well before that, faster recovery than my medical team had initially projected, a recovery they attributed, in part, to how quickly I'd received treatment thanks to my own training and the specific, deliberate actions I'd taken in those critical first minutes. I think about that period often now, sitting in my garden some evenings, genuinely grateful for a recovery that could have gone considerably worse. How much of the people we love we simply stop actively believing, not because we've decided their instincts don't matter, but because trusting someone's urgent concern fully would require actually disrupting our own carefully planned life, and it's always easier, in the moment, to let a more measured, second-hand assessment give us permission to proceed with our own plans instead. I think, too, about how close that Tuesday phone call came to being the last real conversation I ever had with my daughter, and how differently this entire story might have ended if I hadn't happened to have decades of emergency training sitting quietly in my memory, ready to activate the moment it was actually needed. Not everyone facing a similar moment has that training. Not everyone recognizes the specific numbness, the specific weakness, quickly enough to act with the clarity I managed that Saturday morning. I've thought more than once since the stroke about how many families learn this exact lesson too late, discovering only in grief what I was fortunate enough to discover in a hospital room instead. I don't regret describing my symptoms to Rachel as clearly and urgently as I did that Tuesday evening, even though the urgency wasn't enough, on its own, to change her decision. I want to say that plainly, because I know some people hearing this will wonder whether I should have been even more forceful, whether I should have simply told her not to go rather than trusting her to weigh the information appropriately herself. I've thought about that question considerably since the stroke, and I've concluded that the actual lesson here isn't about forcing urgency onto someone who isn't ready to receive it. It's about what happens afterward, when the cost of not listening becomes undeniably clear, and whether that lesson actually changes anything going forward, or simply produces a temporary wave of guilt that fades once the crisis passes. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a garden in the evening, once the light has gone soft, and the only sound left is whatever the crickets have decided to contribute to the conversation. I sit in that quiet most nights now, and I don't feel any different for the recovery itself, or for Rachel's changed attentiveness, or even for the medical power of attorney sitting properly filed away with my other important documents. If anything, I feel more at peace than I have in years. Not because the crisis validated my own vigilance about health warnings, but because my daughter finally understands, in a way that's actually changed her behavior rather than simply her intentions, what it costs the people who love her when their urgent concerns get quietly weighed against something more convenient. What I've learned watching Rachel rebuild a genuine kind of attentiveness to my well-being over these past months is that sometimes the people we love need to actually witness the real cost of dismissing our concerns before the lesson fully lands. Not because we should have to nearly lose our lives to be taken seriously, but because human beings, even genuinely loving ones, sometimes require direct evidence before an abstract warning fully registers as something worth reorganizing their own plans around. I spent 39 years teaching young people to recognize warning signs and respond appropriately, professional training that ultimately saved my own life during those critical minutes alone on my living room floor. It took an actual stroke, 6 days after a warning that got filtered down into something that felt postponable, for my own daughter to understand exactly what those warning signs had actually meant, and exactly what almost happened because a wine-tasting weekend felt, in that moment, more certain than an uncertain medical concern 3 hours away. If this story reminded you of a moment when your own urgent concern got quietly weighed against someone else's plans, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you believe every warning sign deserves to be taken seriously the first time, not after the crisis proves it right, hit subscribe, because we've got a new story like this one for you